Good afternoon. This is Eric Tonkery, Director of Marketing Education and Professor of Marketing at Rutgers Business School. It's my pleasure today to have Associate Professor Arash Azadegan with the Supply Chain Management Department to discuss with us his latest article in the Journal of Supply Chain Management. Arash, how are you doing today?
Doing great. Thank you, Eric.
Great. Before we get started, could you share with our audience your specialty in supply chain management, your research specialty?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. This is a great opportunity, and thanks for all that you're doing for setting these events up. I actually look at a change across the supply chain, both positive and detrimental change. Positive in terms of innovation and new product development. I started there, but since the past 7 or 8 years, the notion of detrimental change, be it supply chain disruption, be it risks, and of course, what we're going to be talking about, resilience, has been the primary focus because I think there's a lot that we can learn about how to minimize the potential downsides of things gone wrong.
Okay, very good. So in the title of your new article, in the Journal of Supply Chain Management, it's called A Typology of Supply Network Resilience Strategies, all right, complex collaborations in a complex world. So caught my attention is that you kind of talk about resilience and you tie in with macro resilience, micro resilience, and so forth. Before we get into those different types of resilience, I think it might be good to share with our audiences, how do we define resilience?
Right, very good. It's an excellent question, and that is, we throw the word around, and I'm not sure if everybody is comfortable or familiar with exactly what it means. Most folks would know resilience is really bouncing back from adversity, and at the organizational level, resilience it takes a different form. It becomes a bit more complicated in that a lot of resilience depends on people's reaction. And so, yeah, but in a nutshell, resilience is the ability to bounce back. And we do that in two forms. Either we're prepared enough to make sure that a disruption or an event doesn't affect us as deeply, so the damage is minimized, or that we can respond quickly so that the damage is rectified as soon as possible and faster. And so that essentially is the two dimensions of resilience.
Okay, and in the case of, you certainly were going through COVID-19 pandemic here in early 2021, 2021, and how has that pandemic, assuming that an organization has been resilient before, how's the pandemic really tested that resilience?
Right. So the pandemic is a unique type of mega disasters, as we would consider it in this special issue, is that other disasters that we've had have been either on the demand side or on the supply side. On the supply side is when we have a supplier that is unable to provide, could be a factory fire, could be a flooding and whatnot. So we run out of inventory or the capacity to produce items. On the demand side, let's say there's a hurricane and people are relocated. And so there's a bit less opportunity to sell your product because the market has changed. Now, the interesting part about COVID is that we really have both sides, both the demand and supply affected. And so this is a unique circumstance where firms are recognizing the potential factors of having to deal with both the upstream and downstream of the supply chain. And so practically everyone has learned now the detrimental impact of it, and everybody's been affected.
Okay, thank you, Rush. In the paper, you make a distinction between different levels of resilience, right? You mentioned macro, and you mentioned micro level resilience. And then you talk about this, which was kind of a new term for me when I read it, was meso level resilience. Could you, for our audience, explain the breakdown of each of those three terms?
Sure. So micro level resilience essentially is what is typically known as supply chain resilience. And that is, downstream members of the supply chain work with upstream members and they pool their resources together as much as possible. So it could be a downstream manufacturer that recognizes the potential for a supplier to have additional stock or inventory, or perhaps that a supplier recognizes that a manufacturer can change their demand planning to accommodate a shortage that they have. So that's a micro level resilience at the supply chain. It's firm and friends, so to speak. On the other hand, macro level resilience is what we see and when we see the government and larger size institutions getting involved. So, for instance, Operations Warp Speed for developing the vaccine faster occurred with the involvement of the federal government. Anytime FEMA gets involved, it becomes a macro level resilience. Anytime you have let's say the security groups involved, that becomes the macro level. But as we look at these two, we're recognizing that there's something missing. A single supply chain and this aggregate country level resilience just don't match up with what the potential reasoning or logic is. So this notion of meso level resilience is basically sandwiched in between those two. And this is not the first time that the topic has been brought up or used. I should say used, but it has been very effective. And how we define it is essentially by firms from the same industry that might be even competitors, and firms across industries to come together to enhance the resilience. I'll give you a couple of examples. One relates to what's called COVID Healthcare Coalition, which involves LabCorp, the biggest testing organization, Microsoft, Amazon Web Services, and Mayo Clinic. And so what those guys have been trying to do is working on developing means to sterilize and reuse N95 masks, for instance. So that's a kind of a meso level resilience that we're talking about.
Okay, really good. What are no matter what the level now, because we supposedly, as the rollout of the vaccine is happening as we speak, with Moderna and Pfizer and so forth, and as more people get vaccinated, and then we get maybe some kind of return to some normalcy, maybe later in 2021, as organizations plan ahead this year, whether they're large, whether they're a Fortune level firm, medium-sized firm, or small business, what are two constructive things that a owner of the business or our executive level person can do, being mindful of the fact of that there are small crises that can pop up and so forth like that. What are some two constructive things they can do going forward to, either prevent a crisis happening or mitigate its impacts to its own business?
Sure. The two that come to mind, number one is pre-planning. And, this is no different than what we know as in terms of resilience. A lot of the ability to bounce back, it depends on how you've planned it. But we've advocated for physical level of pre-planning and pre-staging, if you will, be it inventory, be it excess capacity, be it extra or redundant suppliers. So firms know about that, but what I can advocate for, and this actually comes from another article in Production Operations Management that we just published, is pre-staging your relationships, right? Getting to know people ahead of time, saying hello, even to your competitors, right? So Toyota, General Motors, and Nissan had to get involved together on an event that happened a few years back, which we mentioned in the article, that was, on an urgent basis. Imagine if we actually knew each other. Doesn't mean we would collaborate, but when it comes to risk, and disasters, there's no time to start developing or trusting one another. So that's number one, developing your relationships ahead of time. Number two is just situational awareness across the organization. And because, a lot of companies, for instance, are putting an executive on the board called Chief Risk Officer, and which is interesting, not a bad thing, but on the other hand, it may suggest that risk is one person's responsibility, whereas that's not the case at all. Risk is something that everybody in the organization needs to be aware of and situationally aware. So situational awareness, be it listening to the news and having your ears to the wall type of a thing to know what's going on in the external world, becomes very, very important. And we're realizing that those that don't do so are just going to fall behind.
Well, very good. Arash, thank you for your time today. Very interesting discussion on this subject. I don't think it's going to be obsolete anytime soon. We're obviously living in a very dynamic time. Certainly was evident this past year in 2020, and certainly will be going forward. So the article again is titled "The Typology of Supply Chain Network Resilience Strategies: Complex Collaborations in a Complex World," and it's published in the recent edition of the Journal of Supply Chain Management. And for those in the audience who want to find the article, you go to the website of Journal of Supply Chain Management.com, and you can read further about the article. Arash, thank you for your time today.
You bet. Thank you, Eric.